Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Mandelson, a homosexual history, a special series from the creators of Bad Gays. My name is Ben Miller. I'm a writer and historian, a member of the board of the Schwules Museum in Berlin, and currently at work on a biography of the fashion designer Rudy Gernrich.
And my name's Hugh Lemmy. I'm a writer and author.
And as a reminder, Mandelson, A Homosexual History is a series built around the idea that the life of Peter Mandelson is a scandalous gay skeleton key to everything that's gone wrong in politics in the West in the last 40 years. Last week, we looked at Mandelson's early years and his move from a flirtation with Marxism to being on the hard right of the Labour Party. We also discussed the splits in the Labour Party and how in the 1980s those splits became a full-blown civil war. If you haven't heard that first episode yet, you really should. All of that context will be very useful when we understand and think about Mandelson's continued political career. As we left Peter in 1985 when, despite his very ugly baby blue socks, he'd just been appointed as Director of Political Communications to the leader of the Labour Party, Neil Kinnock. And this was at a moment when the right of the party was wresting control from and purging the left, using a leader who had run as a soft left unity candidate. And surely nothing like that would ever happen again.
So yes, we're not talking about 2020, we're talking about 1985. Well, in today's episode, we're going to talk about Peter Mandelson's life in the late 1980s. It was a time of a rising homophobia driven in partly by the HIV/AIDS crisis, but one that was politicised by the Conservative government eventually in Section 28, and we'll talk a bit about that. And we'll also focus on how this homophobia would go on to affect Peter Mandelson's own personal and political life. So it's 1985, and Mandelson has very big ambitions for the Labour Party, as we discussed. And in Neil Kinnock, he sees someone who could be the perfect engine for this transformation. Kinnock is a man of impeccable Labour credentials. He's the child of a Welsh coal miner and a nurse. And in his earlier career, he was on the left of the party, increasing his perception that the reformation of the party would be a pragmatic project towards electability rather than a sort of capture of the party by its right. Secondly, his moves to end the party civil war and to suppress the left showed that he had authority over the party, and that would appeal to an electorate who, in this telling of the story that Mandelson's thinking, were turned off by the party's, let's say, excitable democratic atmosphere. And lastly, of course, he'd shown himself willing to make compromises on issues like the EEC, the European Economic Community, and on defence, which Mandelson thought would be necessary to win back those swing constituencies of middle-class voters who they'd lost under Michael Foot. So with Mandelson now in charge of communications, they began preparing for the 1987 general election. At a dinner party, and lots of this story happens at dinner parties, Peter Mandelson had met this young advertising whiz kid called Philip Gould, who had moved from the advertising industry into polling, establishing his own consultancy working on polling and strategy. So Gould had Mandelson's ear at his party, and he informed him what he thought that the strategy should be. And Gould was very much thinking ahead. He provided Mandelson with a list of attack lines that he thought the Tories would use at the next election, and he suggested that the Tory approach would be to spread fear of Labour policies, and that would work, and that Labour should take the same tack. And lastly, he suggested Peter's first task in his new job would be a comprehensive review of the communication structures. And so that's exactly what Mandelson did. And Gould instantly would be brought into the fold, and he'd go on to be the strategy and polling advisor for the party for the next 20 years or so. But what Mandelson found was that the Labour communication strategy was stuck in the Stone Age. It was badly organised. It was focused on old-fashioned techniques like public meetings rather than like radio and television campaigning. You know, radio is 60 years old at this point, but they still hadn't adopted it. And then the whole thing was very badly organised throughout. There was a total disconnect between ideas of strategy and advertising and polling. And this will actually blow your socks off. He claims that the party's advertising agents didn't meet the party's pollster, the one who does the polls, a single time during the election campaign. So there's complete...
What?
Yeah, it's complete disconnect. And there's, you know, perhaps the more idealistic people amongst us might think, well, who cares? You know, politics is about principles, not just following the electorate. But this disconnect is important for real politics because it shows a complete neglect of any sort of feedback within the campaign. Like without the polling...
You need to understand whatever your principles are, you need to understand whether you're is convincing people of your principles effectively or not, right? You know, Think about the campaign of someone like Zoran Mamdani, who has impeccable principles, but who was also both himself and surrounded by a great deal of kind of strategic genius in terms of both building this very robust old school organizing campaign, but also thinking very, very, very strategically about what kinds of messages were resonating and what kind of messages weren't, and really focusing on bringing people along with the messages that resonated.
Right. And without knowing the polling responses to their advertising and propaganda campaigns, then how can the party understand at all what's working, what the shifting mood is within the electorate? And these are the sort of questions that this new guard under Mandelson was obsessed with asking. And it started very quickly to change the party's outlook. So Mandelson and Gould created a new group with this wonderfully supervillain name called the Shadow Communications Agency. And this group was made up
Oh
of...
my God.
Yes.
I think we should have renamed the whole miniseries the Shadow Communications Agency.
So the Shadow Communications Agency was this group made up of volunteers who worked within the advertising and communications and polling industries who wanted to donate their expertise to help towards a Labour victory. It was clear that the 1987 election was going to be very different to the previous elections in terms of strategy. And the SCA introduced this whole host of new techniques from the polling industry. But perhaps the most telling is Gould's own remark when he said that the SCA would be, quote, an organizational mechanism that can both act as a catalyst and a continuing force for change, end quote. I.e., the group wasn't merely going to sell the Labour Party to voters, but it would feed back and change the Labour Party, not through, the political will of the membership at conference, as it traditionally happened, but through what this sort of market of public opinion might say.
Right.
So it would be a responsive Labour Party, one might say. And this becomes a core tenet of party policy until today, essentially. So the SCA introduced, as an example, the focus group into policy-making decisions. Mandelson also wanted to move beyond the traditional democratic structures of the party into what he called the directors group, instead of those traditional committees that would oversee that sort of strategy. So that committee in the Labour Party in the UK is called the National Executive Committee, or NEC. And it's the governing body which controls the overall strategy, direction, policies, organisation of the party. So, you have the Prime Minister, and you have, if you're in power, or the leader of the party, and you have, the cabinet, and that's doing the politics. But the organisation of the party itself is a National Executive Committee, and it's made up of representatives of all these different aspects of the Labour Party, so the trade unions and MPs and constituency parties, but also with the various societies that are affiliated to the Labour Party, etc., etc. And what this group does is oversee the overall strategy and policies of the party. And it's the core of democracy in some ways within the party. And it's extremely powerful. It's what can shape, how the party is organized, what direction it's going in. And it's very important to have control of that group. And this became, in some ways, the enemy of the directors group, which was Mandelson's own group for trying to influence that structure and shape of direction for the policies of the party. So that is a National Executive Committee.
So what that most resembles, I think, in the U.S. context is the Democratic National Committee, which is the 200-odd member organization that governs the Democratic Party. And I think it's a bit odd, probably, for a lot of our listeners in the U.S. context to imagine the DNC as like a bastion of inter-party democracy, or as representative of a progressive or a kind of will of the members position among all of the various kind of party organs. But that just has a lot to do with the different ways that parties are organized. And it's because the UK Labour Party has this historical tie to the labor movement, where it really is the party of that movement, that, at least in my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Hugh, you know more about this than I do, all of those organizations in the Labour Party historically had a quite left-wing slant because they were very connected to organized labor and to members, as opposed to something like the Democratic National Committee, which has been more donor-driven and more centrist for much longer.
Right. And each of these different parts of the Labour Party, whether that be trade unions or affiliated other organisations, each of these different official organisations have democratic rights to having people sitting on the National Executive Committee. So in theory, it's supposed to shape the direction of the party separate from the Prime Minister or the leader of the party who is doing that sort of politics with the electorate.
Right. So the idea is that this is a party internal organization that is overseeing strategy, that is making sure essentially that the parliamentary representatives of the Labour Party can't just decide, well, today Labour means this and just go do that.
That's 100% what we're talking about, yes. And obviously,
Right.
because it's drawn from all different aspects of the party, then it's much harder for somebody like Peter Mandelson to go in and say, okay, we're going to change these things. And hence he sets up the National Executive Committee as, in some ways, the enemy.
Because on the one hand, he wants to wrest control of the party away from people who are keeping ties to organized labor and to the organized left. And on the other hand, he wants to introduce a much more centralized and much more managerial strategy internally, which would also mean removing power from this group. So it's two different goals, one of which has to do with how you do things and one of which has to do with your actual politics. And
Yes.
both of them involve Mandelson taking over more power from this elected group.
Absolutely. And so
Isn't it nice when everything that you want to do results in you having more personal power, Hugh?
What a coincidence. And actually, he would say this to the Shadow Communications Agency. He warned them. He said, do not forget this is a political party. All the time in the Labour Party, you are boxing with those people in the National Executive Committee to whom, at the end of the day, we are all ultimately accountable below God, who do not know what they are doing, who, if they did, would oppose it, who are thoroughly indisposed to all these methods, and with whom you have to play it very carefully, end quote.
So in other words, he's advocating lying and deceit as a way of basically tricking people into not realizing what they're doing and what they're giving up.
He would probably call it spin.
As I said, lying and deceit.
Yes,
Okay, you
public
go.
relations. And actually, in their 1990 book, Labour Rebuilt, so this is before, the 1997 election, a long time before, when this process is still happening, the journalists Colin Hughes and Patrick Winter suggested that Gould and Mandelson had this very well-oiled, clearly defined process. Quote, their division of responsibility was clear. Gould diagnosed and evaluated. Mandelson carried out the surgery. The analysis produced by Gould was delivered with force majeure by Mandelson. Sometimes Mandelson openly stated that proposals were coming from the outside experts in the belief that the politicians were more likely to swallow their advice than his own. On other occasions, he felt obliged to conceal the source of his material for fear that politicians would shy away from marketing and media manipulators. It was Mandelson who implemented the findings, often taking enormous political risks to his own position in order to do so, end quote. So Gould was strategizing. He was coming up with the sort of expert position in terms of marketing and publicity and things like this. And then Mandelson was the political operator with the sharpened blade who'd go in and get things done.
And to be fair to Mandelson and Gould, there probably was a need at that time for the Labour Party to change the way that it was doing things, right? If basic elements of the campaign are not communicating with one another, if organizational decisions require way too many committees to respond quickly in the heat of a political campaign to figure out a strategy or an attack, that's not functional either, right? But what they do is they then, on the one hand, push through these changes, and on the other hand, all of it is actually in service of this different political agenda. And at what point does that start becoming clear?
It becomes clear around the time of the 1987 election, but there's actually an 86 by-election, which we'll talk about, which is very important as well, where you get to see it happening. And the reason, I mean, yes, you're right. The Labour Party is a juggernaut. It's like a huge oil tanker, and turning it is very, very slow if you're going to do it properly. And you're right in terms of, Labour had lost 2 elections, and for politicians as iconoclastic and polarizing as Margaret Thatcher to win, and for her government to win, it's not just about them being competent. You also have to have an incompetent opposition. Very much the same in the United States at the moment. The reason that Trump can get away with doing what he's doing is because the opposition are incompetent. So in 1986, they had this chance to test out this new model, this new operating model, when Martin Stevens, who was Tory MP for Fulham, had died unexpectedly, which triggered a by-election, which in the US I think you call a special election. The Tories had this solid 12-point majority in the seat, so it was not a great start for Labour. And to make matters worse, the Labour vote looked like it might be split by the new SDP, Social Democratic Party, candidate, Roger Liddell, who had been actually on the right of the Labour Party before he'd left the party to become a founder member of the SDP. So Not looking good for Labour from the start. And what's more, Liddell and his wife, Caroline Thompson, had been old friends of Peter Mandelson's, regular dinner party companions. And indeed, there was little more than a fag paper between them politically. Peter was a regular at their home. Roger Liddell was really something more approaching a Gaitskellite, a Labour right than a Liberal. While Rainford, the Labour Party politician who was going to stand for that election, he was much more the sort of middle-class Oxbridge ex-radical who Mandelson had disliked while he was at university. Indeed, while he was at Cambridge in the 1960s, Rainsford had actually got in trouble for climbing on top of King's College Chapel to hang a banner protesting the Vietnam War. So a very strange sort of mix-up here going on. It looked really like it was going to be an uphill battle and, of course, a personal one for Peter Mandelson. But the new era of political communication that was drawing on the talents of these ad men and women handed them this victory. It was almost a 10% swing to Labour, and they won the seat. And Philip Gould would later claim that it was, quote, the first time that professional marketing techniques on this scale had been used in a by-election, end quote. And that Fulham was, quote, an important victory which had helped counter the growing impression that the entire Labour Party in London was in the grip of the loony left. That's certainly the case, although, as we've seen in recent months in the UK, by-elections are notorious for throwing up losses to incumbent governments anyway. But at the vote count, Caroline Thompson, Roger Liddell's wife, approached Peter Mandelson, and she really let him have it about him coordinating what would be an embarrassing defeat for her husband. But what's fascinating and really illuminating about this election is that Caroline Thompson's response really demonstrates how deeply personal and social this whole world was and remains, and how these groups of friends managed to rise together throughout their careers. You know, it's a family business almost. So, for example, despite being the SDP candidate,
Almost no matter what party you are.
absolutely, yeah, the same for both parties. So, despite being the SDP candidate, Roger Liddell would later return to the Labour Party under Tony Blair. So Roger Liddell is now a baron, Lord Liddell, in the House of Lords. He was supported into the House of Lords by Peter Mandelson. Caroline Thompson, who was his wife, would go on to become the CEO of the BBC. She herself was the daughter of George Thompson, who was a Labour MP, who was Secretary of State for Defence under Harold Wilson, who then became a Lord too. Philip Gould would later become a Lord, and his wife, Gail Rebuck, is also a Baroness. And so to complete the happy families, their daughter, Georgia Gould, is, you'll never guess it, a member of Keir Starmer's cabinet. So a Labour MP.
It's one big club and you're not in it.
Exactly. And in fact, one of the reasons that Caroline Thompson berated Mandelson at the vote count wasn't just for his lack of loyalty at work, but also in his home life. So since 1982, Mandelson had owned a home in Clapham, and he shared it with two friends of his, Pete Ashby and Sue Robertson. And the ruse was quite a good one because although Mandelson wasn't really like in the closet, he wasn't also out of the closet either. So he and Ashby, Pete Ashby, were boyfriends, and living with Sue Robertson allowed people to think kind of whatever they wanted to about what was going on. Although Robertson would sometimes reply that she and Mandelson had shared a roof but not a ceiling, which I think is a really good line. Certainly, these sort of 30-something professionals flat sharing at the time wasn't strange, still wouldn't be strange. But to continue the theme of a certain political inbreeding, so to speak, Sue Robertson, the third woman in this flat share, was working for David Owen, who had been the Labour Foreign Secretary turned SDP. And she was working as his press secretary. So an editor at the Daily Mail at the time thought it was very handy because you could call one phone number and get a quote from both Owen and Kinnock about some political issue because their two press secretaries still lived together. There was this...
Oh my God.
Yeah, it was this mixture of the social and the professional, which of course is far from unusual. Like in our industries as well, it's the same. You know, you share similar interests, you see people at industry events, you collaborate, you work together. But I do think it's instructive to think about when we talk about the sort of corruption scandals that would go on to plague Peter Mandelson's life, including, of course, the current scandal about Jeffrey Epstein, because these relationships do often blur lines. And when you're in public office, those lines often exist for a very good reason.
Well, and this also reminds me of this kind of really amusing kerfluffle that's happened in the past couple of days where Hannah Spencer, who's the newly elected Green Party MP for Gordon and Denton, was asked in an interview what the most surprising thing about being in Parliament was. And she said, well, the most surprising thing about being in Parliament is that everyone's drunk all the time. And like you come in for votes and you're like going into the voting chambers and you can just smell the booze coming off of people. And there was this complete outcry from the British media establishment at her for basically saying she just doesn't understand the culture. She doesn't understand the importance of all of this. Like, of course we're like hanging out together. Like, of course we're all having a drink between votes in these long days. Like, of course, of course, of course. And like, look, without wanting to pathologize people having a drink in the very latter moments of a long workday, right? Like, I've had board meetings at the Schwules Museum that go until midnight, and like at 10 p.m., if we take a break, sometimes I'll have a glass of wine, but like, there's not the stink of alcohol coming off me as
Yes.
I collect a six-figure salary to occupy public office. And the idea that to point that out as a scandal is this very uniquely British thing where like these political institutions, I think, are just that like it's all just so unbelievably clubby. Like it's more unbelievably clubby than you could imagine. It's clubbier than a conspiracy theory could paint it as.
Right. Yeah. Like, I mean, traditionally, so when you have a vote in the House of Commons, there's a bell that goes off. It's called a divisions bell, and that's when you go and vote. And not only in traditionally were there votes within the House of Commons, but they installed division bells in all the pubs around Westminster. So you'd be out having a drink, having a pint, the bell would go off, you'd rush back to vote, you know? Anyway, we'll continue a bit.
One big club and you're not in it.
Exactly. We'll continue a bit with this in a bit, but it was quite an interesting moment in his life because at this time, Pete Ashby, Mandelson's boyfriend, was about to become a father following a relationship. We'll call it a relationship. Some people called it an affair, but judging by what we know of Mandelson's reaction, I think maybe it sounds like they had some sort of arrangement. But this relationship that he'd had with a woman almost a year before, and Mandelson was, by all accounts, very committed to helping out, you know, raising this child who Ashby was co-parenting. And Peter and Pete even actually in the end sold their share of this Clapham home and they moved to Stoke Newington, so right across to a different area of London, so that they could live on the same street as Pete's son and his mother. And Mandelson had always had this very discreet, but like I said, not quite closeted attitude towards his sexuality. Some of his political colleagues knew, the ones who were sort of closer to him, others didn't, but he would never deny it if people asked at this point. And his friends, of course, were very aware. And indeed, actually, Mandelson was a regular at the Tottenham Court Road YMCA at this point, which is a central London gym that was, in its time, of course, the YMCA, legendary for its gay clientele and cruising possibilities. And David Bridle, who was a gay journalist at the time, would remark that, quote, "There was one man who stood out from all the others. He was in his 30s, had a moustache, was tall and noticeably distinguished, and moved between sauna and restroom with an air of preoccupation. Deep in his thoughts, he rarely spoke to others, but nevertheless seemed to enjoy being around these lively, sporty gay men," end quote.
Did he get himself clean? Did he have a good meal? Did he do whatever he feel?
Yeah, well, I find it funny because there is an implication, of course, here that Mandelson was a watcher and not a wanker when it came to the gym sauna. Or you might say it'll take another decade or so before he really became a wanker. But Ben, you can't have exhibitionists without voyeurs and vice versa, you know? That's dialectics.
The immortal science of Marxism, Leninism, YMCA, sauna jerking offism.
So in 1987, just a month before the general election, which he was masterminding at this point, Mandelson was outed for the first time by the Murdoch Sunday tabloid, The News of the World, which was the most popular Sunday tabloid in the UK, but very right-wing and very salacious. It was, you know, it was eventually closed by the Murdochs because of the phone hacking scandal. The stuff it was getting up to was so bad. So they love this sort of story, especially in the 80s, and they splashed with this big headline, "Kinnock's #1 man in gay sensation." And this article detailed his relationship with Ashby and the mother of Ashby's son, Kay Carberry, who incidentally is now in the House of Lords. You see how this is working. And so
It's one big club and you're not in it.
So the details in the paper show just how much Britain has changed in the last sort of 30, 40 years, because the scandalous comments that Mandelson was making are just eminently reasonable to any modern ear, I believe, while the response of the paper now seems like completely unhinged, even though it was the voice of the common man. So Ashby said, quote, "We love each other and we love Joe. Kay approves, so what's the problem? It's a very adult relationship, but we get on great. Peter Mandelson's like an uncle to little Joe. They're very fond of each other. At weekends, we pop round to Kay's house and then we all go out together. Neil Kinnock is aware of the situation and doesn't mind. Peter told him everything, end quote.
Yeah, it's just like normal people having a normal human relationship with one another, I suppose.
Yes. Yeah, and this was appalling at the time. And Joe's mother, meanwhile, said, quote, Peter Ashby and I have a deep affection for each other, but we would never have married. I don't know if Mandelson resented our fling, but he's been marvellous to Joe. He's like a second father, end quote. And then the paper, meanwhile, dropped very strong hints that Mandelson, as a gay man, would present an AIDS risk to the child.
I'm sorry, how would Mandelson present an AIDS risk to the child?
There's no way he would pose an AIDS risk to the child, but this was the 1980s. The reason is that we're at this point in the middle of a moral panic. At this point in the 1980s, the News of the World's line there was probably a good deal closer to representing public opinion on homosexuality than Kay and the two Peters of positions. So let's talk a little bit what it was like to be a gay man in the 1980s in the UK. So since the late 1960s and Labour's liberalisation campaign, changing the law around everything from divorce to homosexuality, there had been a slow but steady increase in public tolerance towards homosexuality. Attitudes were still largely phobic. In 1983, 67% of Brits thought same-sex sexual relations were almost or mostly wrong, while 17% thought they were not wrong at all. However, as the AIDS crisis emerged in the country, this moral panic emerged around homosexuality, fueled by public anxieties and a lack of education around HIV and AIDS, and also by an increasingly virulent homophobic campaign by the media. And so as a result, as the 1980s progressed, attitudes towards gay people got considerably worse. So when we arrive here in 1987, the number of people who thought being gay was fine had dropped to just 11%. While those who thought it was almost or mostly wrong had risen to 75%. And that's 3/4 of the population. In the general election, the Tories ran an explicitly homophobic campaign. They had these posters featuring cartoons of gay men on the protest with their arms around each other's shoulders, with placards reading Gay Lib and Gay Sports Day. Another famous Conservative poster from the 1987 campaign had the banner, Is this Labour's idea of a comprehensive education? And then featured 3 red books, of course, with the titles Police Out of School, The Playbook for Kids About Sex, and Young, Gay and Proud. And underneath was the strapline, Take the politics out of education, vote Conservative.
And the thing about specifically that Gay Sports Day fear-mongering is how precisely it resembles the moral panic about trans people right now. Like, precisely, exactly, right? Like, right now it would be trans kids are going to play sports, and that's why we have to get the politics out of education and vote for the right. Or I guess at this point, that's Labour's line, too. And it really does point to the kind of, not just the ethical rot, but also the strategic idiocy of the absolutely brain-dead right-wing gay and lesbian morons who are going along with this transphobia thing, I guess because they think it's going to make them safer. And all I have to say about that is everyone with that position should be forced to Google Amsterdam every day.
Right, but I think it's a very clever attack line for politicians, because there are lots of people who regard themselves as liberal or even libertarian about other people's personal behaviour, but still hold an essentially phobic worldview. And when it comes to the kids, then they can activate that. I don't mind what people do in their own bedrooms, but let's not have sex education for children sort of vibe.
Right, and the idea being, of course, that sexual education for children is going to somehow be some form of sexualization or child abuse, when in fact it can probably help defend against it, actually.
Yeah,
comprehensive sexual education.
Yeah, teaching children, the proper names for parts and how to talk about them and what's appropriate and what's not appropriate is good education.
Exactly, very important.
So this story has been, of course, told before, and I'm sure many of our listeners who lived through that period in the UK will remember it very well. What's worth coming back to, I think, for us, is how this homophobia at the time, this queer phobia, was not just the result of the moral panic that accompanied the start of the AIDS crisis, but was also the result of the very peculiar electoral politics of the UK. So the attacks on gays weren't just an attack on gays. It wasn't just a homophobic attack on gays, but it was an attempt by the Tories to suggest that the supposedly extreme or radical politics of the Michael Foot-era Labour Party was being continued under Neil Kinnock. And as such, it was an attempt to split a left vote by forcing the Labour Party to deal with this division between its sort of socially liberal and socially conservative aspects of its base. And throughout the 1980s, the Tories and the media, the right-wing media, which is the majority of the media in the UK, had made very significant political capital over the policies and campaigns of the Greater London Council, which was the council in charge, of course, of administering the whole of the Greater London area. And since 1981, it had been controlled by socialist candidates from the left of Labour, especially the council leader, Ken Livingstone, who was known in the media as Red Ken. And so under Livingstone, the GLC introduced a lot of new social campaigns around sexism, around racism and homophobia, and provided funds to help local groups that were aimed to tackle these sort of social issues and problems. These today are very widely held positions across much of the political spectrum. And while they had been, at the time, quite popular for London voters, constituents, they were widely ridiculed as metropolitan, sort of cosmopolitan, corrupt, even depraved in the national media, out of touch with the real England. And they were policies that derived, of course, from the rise of the New Left, but the media had derided them as policies of what they called the so-called loony left. And the papers loved running articles about these excesses they had. They were actually usually either exaggerated or sometimes just invented. But these included things like the story that Hackney Council in London had banned nursery school children from singing Blah 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 Black Sheep because it was racist, or that they'd banned the use of the term manhole covers because that was sexist.
So this is exactly the same thing that happens now. It's the exact same kind of reactionary bullshit where you hear something like that and you look it up and then it's not really true, or it's vaguely true, or it's, taken crazily out of context, or it's something that one activist said and then got laughed at by everyone else. But then you're supposed to take that as being representative of what the terrifying left is going to do to you. And meanwhile, while everyone is getting riled up about that, the right is coming into your house, stealing your children, handing them to billionaire pedophiles, and also robbing you blind.
It's a classic sort of political maneuver. And actually, it was a political maneuver that Boris Johnson, who later became Prime Minister, cut his teeth on when he was a journalist, doing the same thing about the EU, that he'd write and say, oh, you can't even sell bananas that are bendy anymore. They have to be straight. Or the Italians want to change the law to rename large condoms as extra large, or something like this. And they were either partly or completely bullshit. But you have these people who wind it up on it and it just becomes stuck. Even pretty intelligent, well-read, news-consuming people get this vibe that it might be true. And of course, it's compounded by the fact that there are stories within it which are true. So one of these in this example was the Greater London Council helping to acquire a site and funding for a new London lesbian and gay social centre, which was allowing these terrible things such as daycare centres and meeting rooms for gay groups, I
mean, who could imagine such a thing? It just sounds awful to me.
Yeah. And this became a real problem for Labour, this association with the London councils. And in 1987, Patricia Hewitt, who was then Neil Kinnock's press secretary and a close colleague of Peter Mandelson, wrote to the Labour MP Frank Dobson that, quote, "It's obvious from our own polling, as well as from the doorstep, that the London effect is now very noticeable. The loony Labour left is now taking its toll. The gays and lesbians issue is costing us dear among the pensioners, and fear of extremism and higher tax and rates is particularly prominent in the GLC area," end quote. So the Labour right turned very hard against this so-called loony left. But if gays and lesbians wanted to find solidarity elsewhere, it wasn't very good. Put simply, homophobia was very much a sort of cross-party political position. So from left to right, it was the same. The militant tendency that the Trotskyist group within the far left, they'd long regarded gay liberation as a bourgeois deviation, within this correct class politics. Roy Hattersley on the Labour right was opposed to Labour adopting gay rights policy positions and successfully campaigned to have them removed from the policy platform. A gay newspaper reader might turn to something like the liberal left stalwart of The Guardian, which was edited by the notoriously unsympathetic Paul Preston, which was better than most, but it still referred to things like innocent victims to describe people with HIV who didn't acquire it through sexual contact. Or on Sunday, they could read Richard Ingram's in the liberal broadsheet to The Observer, supporting the statement that, quote, "If the government wanted to launch an effective anti-AIDS campaign, then the slogan 'Sodomy kills' would make a good start," end quote. Or they might, in fact, turn to satirical papers like Private Eye, where they could see cartoons of God ticking gays off his list of plagues, moving on to estate agents, or depictions of gay men imprisoned in cages being fed bananas by zookeepers. What I'm driving at here is that homophobia in the 1980s was a major public position. And that the Conservatives could make significant political capital of attacking gays and lesbians, not just because people didn't like them, because it reminded them of this so-called loony left. The right-wing media, and especially the Murdoch media, was very keen to use LGBTQ people as a sort of dog whistle for what you'd get if you vote Labour, which sounds, as you said, very familiar to a lot of current stuff. And what's telling is who did and didn't support gays and lesbians at this point out of either principle or political expediency. So famously, the Labour Party only managed to adopt a conference resolution for gay rights at the 1985 conference thanks to the block vote of one major trade union, the National Union of Mine Workers. So we see so many similarities of a lot of mainstream readings today. This idea that there's some sort of authentic, socially conservative Labour in traditional, what they call red wall seats in industrial heartlands, but they're being betrayed by middle-class, lefty, socially liberal Labour supporters in the cities, do-gooders.
Our subscribers on Patreon and Apple Podcasts make it possible for us to do all of the work of creating this show and to give out all of the main feed episodes for the show for free. That means our main episodes, our special episodes, and also exciting special projects like this one, and we've got more in the works.
So to help support Bad Gays, head on over to patreon.com/badgayspod or look for us on Apple Podcasts. Subscribers also get access to Extra Bad Gays, a monthly podcast where me and Ben talk about everything queer-related in culture, media, politics, as well as answering questions about love, sex, and everything else from our listeners in our regular Gaggany Gunkles section.
And as we've stated, if you subscribe to Extra Bad Gays, you can always listen one episode ahead to the entire Mandelson, A Homosexual History miniseries. So do head over and check it out. Thanks. So it sounds like Mandelson is outed in this moment when homosexuality is a really hot political issue, is a source of tremendous moral panic, and where there is a cross-party homophobic consensus, and where any political element, like, for example, the London Council, run by a certain group of labor, tries to break that consensus and support gay people and gay organizing, there's a tremendous political and media backlash against them that's very directed and very targeted and very nasty. And so Mandelson is trying to build personal political power inside the Labour Party at the same time as there is this targeted homophobic backlash against any kind of pro-gay policy.
Yeah, and at this point, Mandelson can't strategically take the obvious position, which is to say, like the Labour Party should be supporting gay people, not because of any position around gay people specifically, but because to do that would be to suggest to the voter, we're still loony left. And that's the one thing they're trying to get away from. And it was a very, very heated and complex time for the way that those mainstream parties treated homosexuality. And an example of this, of course, is that the many Tories at this time, many Tory MPs were also gay. I don't have an exact figure, not least because a lot of those gay politicians were closeted, but I'd put money on there being probably more gay Tories than Labour MPs at the time, and not just as a result of their massive majority. And indeed, Martin Stevens, who was the Fulham MP whose death in '86 had precipitated that by-election, he was a Tory MP, but he was not only gay, but he was even a member of the Campaign for Homosexual Equality, which was the big gay rights organisation at the time. And in 1986, we have the Conservative MP Harvey Procter. He resigned after a sting accused him of gross indecency with some, at the time, underage rent boys, which he pled guilty to. On the left of the Tory party, there was Norman St John Stevens and there was Matthew Paris, who went on to become a founder member turned anti-trans critic of Stonewall, the LGBTQ rights organisation. And he will play an important part in Mandelson's story later. And even on the right of the Tory party, you had Michael Brown, who was a gay Tory MP who supported apartheid and capital punishment. There was David Atkinson, another gay MP who was into sort of hang and flog 'em Tories. He was in a closet, and he allegedly had a relationship with the first openly gay footballer, Justin Fashioning. And there was Sir Peter Morrison, the parliamentary private secretary to Thatcher, for whom there's a huge number of credible accusations that he was probably a homosexual paedophile. There was Keith Hampson, the PPS to the defence minister, Michael Heseltine, until he was forced to resign after hitting on someone in a London gay club who turned out to be an undercover cop. And Private Eye, the magazine, actually ran a cover on that with a photo of a policeman and Michael Heseltine with speech bubbles. And the policeman saying, "I hear they found a cure for AIDS," to which Michael Heseltine replies, "Yes, they resign." So there's a little AIDS joke there from Private Eye, which, playing on having an AIDS and having AIDS. So what we see here is this peculiarly British
Nasty, nasty, nasty stuff.
It was horrible stuff, yeah. So we see this peculiarly British approach to sexuality where it's both divorced from politics in a real sense, that you can be a gay, pro-apartheid, pro-death penalty Tory MP, but it's also used as a political football. And one's own sexuality seems to have very little influence on these wider political positions. And on the other side, in fact, we can talk about the very famous Bermondsey by-election of 1983, which is an example of all these tendencies coming together. So Labour ran as their candidate the openly gay political activist Peter Tatchell, who was on the very left of Labour, and that led to a split with this John O'Grady, who was a right-wing Labour council leader who formed what he called the real Bermondsey Labour. And this campaign was marked by this deep, often violent homophobia that was targeting Tatchell. And this homophobic dirty tricks campaign by his liberal rival, who was Simon Hughes, who later became the deputy leader of Lib Dems and then came out as bisexual himself. So it's this big mix. So This gives us some idea of the sort of political uses of homosexuality in the 80s and how it doesn't track onto a left-right axis per se. And even this later idea of being socially liberal and fiscally conservative doesn't work. You have these, Tory members of gay rights groups, you have gay apartheid supporters, Trotskyist anti-gays and gay libbers. You have cosmopolitan North London satirists talking about gay plagues, while the National Union of Mine Workers down the pits is voting for gay rights and coming out on gay pride marches. So here we are in 1987. It's 1 month before the election, and News of the World runs this hit piece outing Mandelson. And it's obviously very upsetting for him personally, and it's trying to capitalise on this homophobia that's tinged with red baiting. It suggests that this move towards the centre by Labour hasn't stopped it being controlled by loonies, as they'd say, and pufters. And Mandelson was upset by the articles, but he had much bigger things to worry about at that time because he was applying all his efforts to this new media strategy and this rebrand. He scrapped the logo that the Labour Party had adopted in 1980, which was the Labour Party name that was fluttering on a red flag, very socialist. And he replaced it with a red rose, which was a very significant change because that was the common symbol of centre-left parties in Europe at the time, and especially in Scandinavia. And he was wanted to emulate those politics as well as just the design. And there's this apocryphal story that at the party conference, this journalist comes up to Mandelson and she asks why the Labour rose is botanically inaccurate because it doesn't have any thorns, to which he replied, "We have enough pricks in the party as it is." Mandelson was thinking about what he hoped would be this big political weapon. The following week, this propaganda coup was supposed to hit British TV screens. In an attempt to modernise the Labour Party communications operation, he commissioned Hugh Hudson, who was the director of the Oscar-winning movie The Chariots of Fire, to make a party political broadcast for Labour. So in the UK, political advertising is illegal on TV and radio, but you're allocated, according to the size of your party, a small broadcast slot. It's called a party political broadcast. So Labour has 10 minutes in which to run this broadcast. And he harnessed all this sort of latest in TV and film techniques to make what became known as Kinnock the Movie. And it starts with footage of a fighter jet tearing across the sky to the sound of Beethoven's Ode to Joy, which is a symbol that the party was sort of moving away from this peacenik, anti-nuclear past towards a patriotic, defence-focused future. And the music choice maybe symbolised that it had binned the Eurosceptic left wing of the party. And then Kinnock's enormous face appears, and he has this focus on welfare and care, and he makes this clear difference between his party and the Tories' image at the time as cold and cruel. And it's this short profile of the man, which also, of course, emphasises his roots in the working class and Welsh Methodism and his family life and his wife and kids. And then, of course, the purging of the left. So they get this huge boost in the polls. Kinnock's personal approval rating jumped 16 points the next day. And the party
Wow.
so it was very big, having a huge effect, and he received this boost in the polls, but it turns out not to be enough, and Margaret Thatcher wins her third election as a landslide. And so having run on this homophobic messaging and seeing it as a hit with public opinion, in the last months of 1987, the Tories really start the ball rolling on their own piece of homophobic legislation, which is Section 28. Section 28 was a part of the Local Authorities Bill that was being brought before Parliament, and the bill made, for the most part, fairly mundane reading, concerning itself with things like competitive tendering for local authority contracts for bin collection. Nobody today talks about Section 38, which abolished duty on dog licenses. But Section 28 forbade the promotion of homosexuality by local authorities, or that they, quote, promote the teaching in any maintained school of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. And this wasn't the first time that Parliament had attempted to introduce this kind of legislation. The year before, in 86, a crossbench peer in the House of Lords, the Earl of Halsbury, introduced a private member's bill with the same objectives. And I'm going to quote a bit of this from Hansard, the official record of parliamentary debates, because it really highlights this link that the Tories and the right-wing media were making between gay rights and the loony left. It's a good temperature check of the sort of quality of discourse happening at the time. Those who make the worst of their situation are the sick ones who suffer from a psychological syndrome whose symptoms are as follows. First of all, exhibitionism. They want the world to know all about them. Secondly, promiscuity. Thirdly, proselytizing. They want to persuade other people that their way of life is the good one.
Well, we're fucked then, Hugh, aren't we?
It gets a lot worse. Fourthly, this is one for you, Ben. Boasting of homosexual achievements as if they were due to and not in spite of sexual inversion. Lastly, they act as reservoirs of venereal diseases of all kind. Ask any venereologist. Syphilis, gonorrhea, genital herpes, and now AIDS are characteristically infections of homosexuals. I was referring to male homosexuals. I did not then think that lesbians are a problem. They do not molest little girls. They do not indulge in disgusting and unnatural practices like buggery. They are not wildly promiscuous, and they do not spread venereal disease. It is part of the softening up propaganda that lesbians and gays are nearly always referred to in that order. The relatively harmless lesbian leads to the vicious gay. That's what I thought then, and what I still in part continue to think. But I've been warned that the loony left is hardening up the lesbian camp, and they are becoming increasingly aggressive. One of the characteristics of our time is that we have, for several decades past, been emancipating minorities who claimed that they were disadvantaged. Are they grateful? Not a bit. We emancipated races and got inverted racism. We emancipated homosexuals and they condemn heterosexism as chauvinist sexism, male oppression, and so on. They will push us off the pavement if we give them a chance. I am, in their jargon, a homophone, a heterosexist exploitationist. The whole vocabulary of the loony left is let loose in a wild confusion of Marxism, Trotskyism, anarchism, and homosexual terminology.
Sounds great. When does it start?
It's worth pointing out here that
But wait, did he say homophone as
homophone?
not homophobe, or is
No,
it
he said homophone.
He said homophone.
Yes, he is a peer. Out to sea. It's worth pointing out at this stage, of course, that when we're talking about the House of Lords, which is Britain's second chamber, the equivalent to the Senate in the US, that the vast majority of members, including this horrible prick, were hereditary peers. They'd never stood for election. They only received this position because their dad was a peer and so on. It's not the case today, of course. The majority of peers are life peers who are chosen by political parties. But I've got a question for you. When was the right of the last hereditary peers to sit in the House of Lords abolished and hereditary peers finally removed from the second chamber, Ben?
So what you're asking me is, in what year did Britain stop allowing completely unelected aristocrats to have say over government because of their bloodline?
Yes.
I'm going to go with last year.
Pretty close. It was the 18th of March this year.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And
What?
And if we're going to continue with the ludicrousy of the House of Lords, I'd say that the UK is the only country in the world to have clerics sitting in its legislature as like a matter of course, with the exception of one other country. But what country is that, Ben?
Is it Iran?
It is Iran, but I have to say Iran is painfully woke because Iran also reserves seats for clerics from other minorities, like the Baha'i and the Jewish community, whereas in the UK, it's only Anglicans. Anyway, back to Section 28. The targeting of schools and education is, of course, deliberate. The targeting of schools and education we've already discussed is a deliberate wedge issue. A year before, in 1986, the national newspapers had reported that a book of homosexual propaganda called Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin was being stocked in London's school libraries. A bit like the supposed scandal with Mandelson and Ashby's familial relationships, it can be very hard today to understand what all the fuss is about. The book itself is this picture book that was published in translation by London's Gay Men's Press, which was an independent publisher but had previously received grants from the Greater London Council. So it features Jenny, who's this young girl who's being raised by two men, Eric and Martin, and it's really tame. You know, the family eat breakfast in bed, they go to laundrette together, they argue, they make up. But newspapers ran headlines like, "Vile book in school, pupils see pictures of gay lovers." while MPs like the redoubtable bigot Jill Knight, later Baroness Knight, because of course, she said, quote, "It's terrifying to me that local councils have been promoting that kind of stuff. I could give the House many examples, but I shall not go on. There is a pile of filth, and it's shocking when one considers it's all paid for by the rates," end quote. And she claimed that children in the capital could access the book in libraries. Ben, I'm just going to show you a picture of Baroness Knight.
Okay. So the caption of the photograph is, Jill Knight, in 1992, she claimed to have been besieged by concerned parents and complained of being hectored by the Gay Liberation Front. And what I'll say about Jill Knight is that if you piss off the gays, that's what your hair and makeup will look like.
Yeah, and she actually she voted against gay marriage like in 2012 or whatever. And here's a quote from her defending the position at the time. Quote, "We've all got good friends who are homosexuals. They're often extremely clever and very good at artistic things. Very good at things like antiques. Knowledgeable. No reason at all to say that they're not loving." And then she voted against gay marriage. We need to develop a sort of horseshoe theory of gay icons because she's so close to being an absolute diva, but she's sadly a wretched bigot.
Oh my God. God.
It's such
Sorry, I'm looking at this. No, yeah, it was in 2013 actually that Jill Knight said, quote, "Marriage is not just about love. It is about a man and a woman, themselves created to produce children, producing children. A man can no more bear child than a woman can produce sperm, and no law on earth can change that." I once again want to ask why these people who are so concerned about children being exposed to filth seem to spend more of their free time thinking about other people's genitals than me, a certified pervert. Like, I don't spend this much time thinking about strangers' genitalia. I was raised right. That's all I can say.
So in reality, and of course, despite being remarkably tame anyway, it was never actually in any school library. There was a single copy of it that was in a teacher's centre, which teachers could consult themselves if they wished to. But the propaganda value of it was too high. And so it was cases like this book and of course the GLC funding for the London Lesbian and Gay Community Centre that helped propel this bill into law. The new law went onto the books as the Local Government Act 1988, and as a result, it prohibited any real discussion of homosexuality in schools or in youth groups, as well as, of course, the offering of any sort of support for young LGBTQ people in coming out, in coping with bullying, and anything. In the end, there was actually never any successful prosecutions under the law, but it was on the books for my entire school career. It was 2003, I think, they ended it. And I can attest from personal experience just how powerful it was in its chilling effect. You know, gay kids were often mercilessly bullied throughout those years, and teachers felt very powerless to step in to help because they were scared they'd break the law. And maybe worse, of course.
Right, and just to be clear, that's the goal. The goal is that the state endorses this kind of social murder.
Yeah.
And that is the goal now with trans kids. The goal with all of this stuff now with trans kids is that people are too afraid to step up and to say something and to stand up.
And when I was 14 and being, beaten up in the locker room at PE, and I went to my form tutor, who was very nice, very sort of nice science teacher, and said to her, "I'm being beaten up and it's because I'm gay." She kind of sucked air through her teeth and said, "I can't really step in to do anything about it." And their solution to this problem was to move me. I went to the art block rather than being in PE. That's just one little anecdote of the sort of general atmosphere, that even if you're being bullied, you couldn't really get any help with it because they were very scared about overstepping this line and being in the news of the world. And in fact, when I was at school,
Right.
the only non-heterosexual sex education I got was my class being forced to watch Philadelphia, the Tom Hanks film, which was worse than nothing, really, because it just reinforced my sort of classmates' belief that homosexuality and AIDS were essentially the same thing.
This was like in my comprehensive sex education class in Massachusetts, in liberal Massachusetts, where the way that we discussed sexual assault was we watched an episode of the college TV soap Felicity, in which Felicity's friend gets date raped, and then had 3 minutes of discussion in the remaining class section,
Yes.
and then never spoke of it ever again.
Yeah, horrifying. But as politics for the Tory party, it worked. It was such a major part of the Conservative playbook at that time that even Thatcher herself mentioned it in her 1987 speech to Tory party conference. Quote, "Children..." Should I do the accent? I won't do the accent.
Yes, you should do the accent.
Children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay. And children who need encouragement, and children do so much need encouragement, so many children, they are being taught that our society offers them no future. All of those children are being cheated of a sound start in life. Yes, cheated.
Hugh, I need you to do the entire rest of the episode in that voice. It's way too good.
Watch out, Gillian Anderson, here I come. But that paragraph will
Watch
be
out,
very
Meryl Streep.
yes, watch out, Meryl Streep. That paragraph will be extremely familiar to anyone who was fighting Section 28 across its long life. But what I think will also give some context to it comes a few lines later, which is often not quoted, where she said, "The key to raising standards is to enlist the support of parents. The Labour left, hard, soft, and in between, they hate the idea that people should be able to choose. In particular, they hate the idea that parents should be able to choose their children's education. The Conservative Party believes in parental choice." End quote. So here, again, we see here this Section 28 is driven by these two factors, one of which is this moral panic against homosexuality that the Conservatives are stoking around AIDS. And the second factor is the usefulness of exploiting that moral panic in order to pin down the Labour Party and to pin it on the Labour Party. So they see a rising...
the utility of the specter of parental choice, and the left wants to take away your control over your children. This is the exact same language that we should all be familiar with now.
Is exactly the same, yes. And attaching it to the question of education specifically allowed those more libertarian members and also gay members of the party to sort of disavow the idea that it's homophobic. It's not homophobic. It's just a matter of parental choice and child protection. It's not morality policing. Although, of course, it would go on to affect very deeply the lives of, at least 2 generations of queer young people, myself included. And of course, the main point is that there is no principle of parental rights actually at play here. It's a moral panic that implies that homosexuality is something that's being pushed on children by left-wing local authorities. And of course, no parent would want that. But of course, parental choice means parents should be able to choose either way. But the law explicitly banned that. So when I was a gay teenager growing up under Section 28, my mum had no choice about whether or not I could learn about it in sex education. No matter how much she thought the school should do that, she couldn't organise, she couldn't become a member of the governors. It was just completely illegal, the whole thing. But it helps to reinforce this split in the public consciousness and public discourse that left-wing councils are pushing queerness, parents are resisting it, and the Conservatives are on the side of the parents. This is the Brits at their most British. It's pure expert divide and rule. So this was a context in which Mandelson was operating as this gay employee of the Labour Party at the time. Homosexuality is this politically toxic issue. We won't go into it here, but we should shout out the very many lesbian and gay people who set themselves to organising against Section 28, and they built these very strong activist networks that would help, in one way, repoliticise LGBT people throughout the 90s and eventually overturn that law. And it also led to the start of the organisation Stonewall, and we can talk more about that later. So despite Labour's failure to make much more than a dent in Thatcher's majority, the election had been this proof of concept for Mandelson's vision of this reformed Labour Party that paid more attention to the media than to conference. But he felt restricted by his position in the comms department, and he was ambitious for a lot more power. And he began hinting at his desire to become an MP for himself. This, of course, was not Kinnock's plan. Kinnock wanted Mandelson to become the director of comms for his own leader's office, and he asked him a number of times, and yet Mandelson said no, and he began planning to get selected as a PPC, a prospective parliamentary candidate. And his friends thought this ambition was misguided. One would later say, quote, "He never struck me as a politician or having political views. He looked to me as someone who operated on a day-to-day technical, not strategic basis." And I think that's quite an astute assessment. But his route to becoming an MP was evidence of this very sound ability at technical plotting. He focused his attentions on Hartlepool, which is an industrial port town in County Durham in the northeast of England, whose MP, Ted Leadbitter, was thinking of stepping down at the next election. And it seems like an unlikely choice at first accounts. It's a place of very strong regional pride. It has a very strong working class heritage. It's more than capable of producing its own Labour MPs. It's an industrial heartland. So this North London mustachioed homosexual was, to all intents and purposes here, he was Eric from Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin. He not the natural candidate you'd think, but there were strategic reasons that made a lot of sense to him. Labour had only lost one election there since the war. It was heavily unionized, and local trade unions had a high degree of voting power in the local Labour Party. And they also had a history of making very generous campaign donations. So he managed to talk around these union leaders and these local branches into supporting him, although he was again subject to a sort of homophobic campaign against him. And speaking on a parliamentary podcast in 2024, he explained what happened. Quote, "So I spent a year literally knocking on every door of every party member and trade union delegate in Hartlepool. And I thought I was doing okay. I was what I was. I was a southern, gay, Oxford-educated smoothie from London. I was not a Hartlepool type, to put it mildly, but I was doing well. And then 24 hours before the selection, my leading opponent in the selection went back to the News of the World story, photocopied the whole story, put it anonymously in brown paper envelopes, and put it through the door of every single party member in Hartlepool and trade union delegate to kibosh me. And that's when I discovered the innate decency of human beings, people in the Labour Party. They recoiled at this. It was such a horrible thing to do, and they gave me 60% backing on the first ballot, and I was home and dry. That's how I became selected in Hartlepool," end quote. So that is this classic Mandelson quote. It's this sort of faux humility, this like acceptance of my own personal weakness, but it's also this sycophantic appeal to the ordinary person on the street. You know, a fundamental claim that his success was down to his own strategy as well, and, you know, that he always wins in the end. I think it's not fair to say he was parachuted in. The National Party didn't want him to do it. They didn't want him to leave the press operation. But I think it is fair to call him a carpetbagger. He's no particular attachment to Hartlepool other than, you know, it's a safe seat. So perhaps we could end this week's episode here. It's 1990, the 11th year of Margaret Thatcher's premiership. Mandelson's recognised the importance of new media strategies and political realignment to improving Labour's chances, but his attempt to steer Kinnock to victory in an 87 election has failed. And he's decided that in order to implement his plan, his best bet is to grab the wheels of power directly and get elected. He's found a safe seat with a retiring Labour MP and has managed, despite these homophobic dirty tricks, to get the candidacy. He's now a PPC. So all he has to do now is to get elected. And after a decade in power, surely it must be Labour's turn to rule. A new election is on the horizon, but it's on the far horizon. So what's going to become of Mandelson's plan? Join us next week on Mandelson, A Homosexual History, to find out.
And if you can't wait for the next episode of Mandelson, A Homosexual History, it's available right now to our Patreon and Apple Podcast subscribers to Extra Bad Gays. So click subscribe on Apple Podcasts or head to patreon.com/badgayspod and keep listening right now.
Bad. 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 Bad gays. Bad gays. Bad gays. Bad. Bad. Bad.